we'll just wait a few more moments here for everyone to join us. We are a minute before start time, so running early. Thank you for joining, everyone. We'll just wait about another minute for participants to join. Thank you, everyone, for joining, who just joined. We're just waiting a few more seconds as more participants are joining us just now. Okay, so welcome everyone, and thank you for joining us for the 2021 UN South Asia Forum on Business and Human Rights. This is the session titled Country in Focus, Pakistan. I'm Dory from Q Design, and I'm also joined by Hermes here, and we'll be helping you with your technical facilitation experience today. Please share any questions or comments to speakers through the chat function at the bottom of your Zoom window. And also note that the session today is being recorded. If you have any questions about Zoom or require technical assistance, please feel free to privately message myself or Hermes using the chat box. So I'll now pass over to Salman. Salman, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much indeed, Dory. Colleagues and friends, once again, a very, very warm welcome to all of you to the second United Nations South Asia Forum on Business and Human Rights. And this is Pakistan country session. My name is Salman Asif. I'm based in Islamabad, Pakistan, and I'm associated with the UNDP. Now, before we formally start the proceedings of the day, let me very quickly run you all through the key objectives of this session. Well, principally, the key objective is to construct an informed and inspiring space for speakers and participants to exchange with each other and reflect on progress, pertinent challenges and opportunities relating to business and human rights in Pakistan. Secondly, we hope to identify together country-specific needs in progressing business and human rights and collectively elaborate country roadmap. Now, in terms of the information and your reflections being fed into this forum, the forum hopes that the inputs provided during the sessions will be collected and submitted to the UN Working Group on Business and Human Rights. The submissions will serve as inputs to the business and human rights towards a decade of global implementation project, and used in elaborating a roadmap for progressing business and human rights more widely and more broadly between now and year 2030. As such, the inputs provided by participants will be instrumental in taking stock of progress and identifying pathways for responsible business in South Asia. So colleagues, with this, it is my very, very happy privilege to invite our first illustrious speaker guest for keynote reflections. And our first guest is Janab Inamullah Khan Sahib, Secretary, Federal Ministry of Human Rights. Prior to joining the Federal Ministry of Human Rights, Inamullah Khan Sahib has served in various administrative positions in Sindh province and federal government. In federal government, he has worked under Ministry of Commerce as Secretary, Trade Development Authority of Pakistan during 2017 and 2019. And he has also served as Secretary, National Heritage and Culture Division till very recently, July 2020. Without further ado, I shall invite Inamullah Khan Sahib for his keynote reflections. Thank you, Inamullah Khan Sahib, Secretary, Federal Ministry of Human Rights. Over to you.
Thank you, Salman. It's indeed a privilege to be part of this session. Recently, after taking over about 2 months back, this was kind of continuation for me in the sense that being Secretary Trade Development Authority, so I had a fair bit of idea as to the working environment and the state of human rights therein. The fact that government of Pakistan is moving forward on this issue of finalizing National Action Plan on business and human rights manifests government of Pakistan's commitment to ensure that human rights abuses during business operations have to be put to an end. Pakistan being a developing economy with its peculiar economic nuances, we have kind of tried to adopt a pragmatic mix of voluntary and obligatory measures to mitigate the adverse impact of human rights violations. The process which we have adopted in terms of preparation of National Action Plan on business and human rights is basically a 5-phase development plan. It is based on series of consultations held with different stakeholders over a period of time. And the first step towards that was the initial initiation, which was shown by the government of Pakistan way back in November 2019 at the annual forum on BHR in Geneva. And subsequently, that commitment was reaffirmed by my predecessor during different cabinet meetings and in Asia Pacific Forum, which was held in June 2020. Subsequently, relevant stakeholders were also identified for consultation processes. From there on, it moved towards assessment and consultation as to what would be the basic methodology which would be utilized for this. As a methodology tool, International Corporate Accountability Roundtable, ICAR framework was used, where a survey of over 150 companies was carried out along with consultation with roughly 200 stakeholders. So some of the very interesting indicators which emerged from that survey was that 61% of the companies which were surveyed, they already have a decent and robust, corporate social responsibility program with human rights components, embedded in it. But some of the issues which were highlighted during the survey was also in terms of gaps which were identified was lack of representation of minorities in the workforce, plus gender balance was also kind of not reflected properly in that. From that stage onwards, Ministry of Human Rights in collaboration with UN moved towards the drafting of the National Action Plan. The first draft was prepared according to the guidance document of UNWG. Additional consultations were also held, and this National Action Plan also contains a very important parameter as to how to implement along with the time frame. So that also identifies indicators for monitoring and evaluating of the steps which were to be taken by the federal government at the strategic level, and then at the provincial level, which is at the operational level or tactical level, so to speak. And finally, the fifth process in that involved is how to keep reviewing or amending or updating the National Action Plan as we go in terms of implementing. And for that purpose, a multi-stakeholder monitoring group is also being proposed in that, which can carry out the gap analysis and subsequently suggest amendments and revisions in the National Action Plan. Some of the features of the draft NAP priority areas are, first and foremost, is financial transparency, corruption, and HR standards in public procurement contracts, along with other pillars. So Pakistan being a developing economy, the pilferage and the leakage is a kind of issue which adversely impacts some of the social development programs also when there are complaints of let's say, for instance, terror financing or money laundering issues. So within this National Action Plan, we have tried to suggest as to how to strengthen the laws which can kind of cater to these things. The first and foremost is passing of Whistleblower Bill and Vigilance Commission 2009, and then develop guidelines to ensure, how to kind of human rights element is to be prioritized within the working environment of the businesses, and establishment of code of conduct for public sector enterprises, and strengthen judicial process in Anti-Money Laundering Act and terror financing, and to constantly review and update PEPRA, which is the Procurement Regulatory Authority Framework, as to make it more transparent, and due diligence should be carried out in terms of how to embed human rights values in that. Then the other pillar, which is part of that National Action Plan, is to ensure equal opportunities at workplace for all the vulnerable groups and women in particular, and the marginalized communities. Then we have to impose some of the labor covenants and laws which are there, leading to abolition of child labor, forced labor, and dealing with occupational health and safety standards. So basically, we are now at a stage where we have drafted the basic draft of this National Action Plan, which has been now made public in the sense for feedback. We have shared it with the Ministry of Commerce as well, and it's been on the website of Ministry of Human Rights for feedback and input. Once we receive that feedback and input, we will collate it and then move forward. So Pakistan is committed to kind of move forward on this issue. In fact, what I've been told, that Pakistan is one of the first countries which has embarked on this pathway to have this National Action Plan on business and human rights. So we have things moving, and hopefully within next 2 to 3 weeks, we will be able to move forward on this in a concrete manner. I once again thank you all for according me an opportunity to address all of you and be part of this exercise. Thanks a lot, Salman. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much indeed. This was Honorable Janab Inamullah Khan Sahab, Secretary, Federal Ministry of Human Rights, sharing the process of development of the National Action Plan on Business and Human Rights in Pakistan. I'll take as I pointed out earlier, that we have a group of very illustrious and experienced speakers in the plenary who would also later join us in the breakout sessions. So I shall invite my plenary speaker with very, very rich experience, Ms. Nida Chaudhry, who's the founder of Lahore Education and Research Network and Women in Law Initiative in Pakistan. Ms. Nida Chaudhry has been a diversity and inclusion advocate with over a decade of experience. She founded Women in Law Initiative Pakistan back in 2016, which works for equality of access and advancement of female legal professionals. She was also the founding chair of the Gender Equality and Diversity Committee of Lahore High Court Bar Association, which she served for 2 years. Currently, she is leading the Federal Ministry of Law and Justice's collaborative project to increase women's representation in law. So very warm welcome to you, Ms. Nida. So just 2 key questions. From your perspective, how do you think that the National Action Plan will impact the private sector? What do you see could be the key challenges for business?
Thank you so much, Salman. You see, thank you so much. The private sector has actually become central to economic activity. And as we know that those activities have implications for human rights. But of course, the private sector is mainly responsive to market forces and is not owned or governed by the state. So you could see that there was a regulatory gap of sorts. Now, in this dynamic, the national action plans, actually, which are essentially policy documents, they play an important part in building that consensus. And they also give businesses, to a large extent, an opportunity to develop voluntary processes and internal policy shifts as stakeholders, as opposed to mere subjects of regulation under a traditional top-down model of regulation. So the national action plans allow for the convergence and for consensus to be built. But as we also know that the private sector is not a homogenized standard that applies to all businesses. In fact, there's a whole range of businesses, from sole proprietors to partnerships, all the way up to public companies that fall under private sector. So it is possible that not all of them would be in a position to implement the National Action Plan to the extent that it applies to them. So we know from the SECP that, the 97% of companies registered in 2019-20 were private companies. But we also know that the biggest employer in Pakistan, through the Pakistan Bureau of Statistics data, we know that the biggest employer is actually the informal sector at 44%, and it is followed very closely by the agriculture sector at 38%. And only 17% of people employed are in the formal sector. And the data that we have in the NAP is basically, it has surveyed 150 companies only, whereas as per SCP, there are about 120,000 companies, a little over that figure. So I think that it's important to understand, and the implications of NAP on private sector and the ability to implement will have to be seen in the light of this breakdown and the variety of companies within the private sector. And we'll also have to look at it in the socioeconomic context as well. For example, NAP proposes to raise the age of employment to 18 without being mindful of the need for children from lower income communities to work in some capacity. And even the ILO Convention 138 makes for concession for countries where economies and education facilities are insufficiently developed. So these are matters on which I believe a national dialogue still needs to take place, and perhaps pragmatic steps for progressive attainment of such goals would be more suitable. The NAP obviously lays down 14 expectations as it has of businesses, but the context is around corporate urban companies where some sort of CSR already exists. But it also has key actions that it expects businesses to undertake, such as setting up internal equal opportunity committees, or it mandates training of their managerial personnel or anti-discrimination, calls for safe, inclusive workplaces. But the most important, I think, requirement that it adds, it's a technical requirements of human rights due diligence under public procurement and for large-scale projects. And it has has its own reporting and disclosure requirements. And all of these, for a small or a medium company, or for any company for that matter, of course, it forces them to rethink their business operations and practices. It definitely adds more compliance, which will scrutiny by public and state, and all of this ultimately will lead to increased cost, which will get transferred back to people. So the businesses are obviously concerned as to whether their products and services would remain competitive or not. Will they be able to bear the additional costs or not? So even the guiding principles themselves recognize that businesses may be placed differently, but we see that the National Action Plan does not appear to cater to that, and says that businesses, regardless of their scale and all, will all have to follow and meet these expectations. So there are two big challenges: lack of clarity for especially the small medium enterprises as to what the incentives, if any, from the government are going to look like. Also, there's still a lot of work on part of the government left to do. For example, there still needs to be a code of conduct or some guidelines. Several of the laws, admittedly, on part of the government, they still have to update them. So there's a lot of clarity that still needs to come out. And of course, at the inclusion and the gender parity and inclusion of religious minority front, the NAP does itself acknowledge that these are additional challenges, social challenges, which would require mindset change and a cultural shift as well. So these are all challenges. But
Thank you
for
very
businesses,
much,
it's
Nida.
ultimately going to be a business question. They will look at what the incentives look like, and will the benefits outweigh the cost or not. So that balance will have to be struck. And
That's a
I'll
very,
end
very
there, that
important point,
basically
Nida.
the small companies and businesses should not be disproportionately impacted.
Thank you very much indeed. Thank you very much, Nida, for highlighting that the National Action Plan allows for convergence, stakeholdership, and consensus, but also highlighting some of the key challenges. For example, the private sector is not a homogeneous group. There's heterogeneity in it, and that heterogeneity needs to be factored in. And you also reminded us that around 40% of the employment sector is actually the informal sector. So the question, how does National Action Plan communicate with the informal sector, and how does it factor in that huge proportion? And you also highlighted the question of low income families and populations, their access to gainful economic activities. But you also finally highlighted two key challenges. One is with regards to the room for clarity on investments for companies who do adopt the National Action Plan. And you reminded us that this would also require legal reform and policy reform. Thank you very much, Nida. We'll hear more from you later in the breakout sessions. Ladies and gentlemen, without further ado, I shall invite my next guest speaker. The next guest speaker is Mr. Atif Sheikh, and Mr. Atif Sheikh is Executive Director of Special Talent Exchange Program. He has been a senior disability inclusive development advisor with over 2 decades of experience of providing training and advocacy. He's currently serving as the Executive Director of the Special Talent Exchange Program, which mainstreams persons with disabilities in the society and in the employment sector and businesses. He has also served the Pakistan Poverty Alleviation Fund as advisor, in addition to undertaking several assignments with UNSCAP, UNDP, World Bank, Oxford Policy Management, EI, and various other international and national development organizations. So without further ado, it is my very happy honor and privilege to invite Atif Sheikh Sahib. Atif Sahib, just 2 quick questions, and then the forum is yours to reflect and to share your thoughts. What are the 3 key issues that policies in Pakistan have highlighted in the past with regards to rights of persons with disabilities, especially in terms of access to decent employment and gainful economic activity? And in your view, how best can this National Action Plan be leveraged by persons with disabilities in the context of business activity, in the context of holding systems and businesses accountable for due diligence on human rights of all. Over to you, Atif Sheikh Saab.
Thank you very much, Salman Sahab. And considering the time limit, I will try to be very brief and try to cover all the little bit background of the work has been done on disability. According to World Report on Disability 2012, people with disabilities are 10 to 15% population of the country, while Pakistan Bureau of Statistics and other statistics available in the country shows that they are 2.49%. There's a huge gap because disability has not been defined according to the international standards in our census forms. But now they have included the Washington Group set of questions definition, and those small set of questions in the upcoming sample surveys. So hopefully we are going to have data which will be matching to the international estimates. But if we conservatively estimate that there are 10%, it's a large population which has been unheard in the policies, not included, uncounted people of the country. In the past, we have only one legislation, 1981 Ordinance for the Rehabilitation and Employment of the Disabled. According to that ordinance, there was 1% quota allocated for persons with disabilities in the employment opportunities, especially by the government, public sector organizations, and private organizations having employees more than 300. So, and this quota was not implemented due to several reasons. First of all, people with disabilities were not aware by themselves about this opportunity. Secondly, the mechanism in place where a responsible institution, National Council for the Rehabilitation of Disabled Persons, was established, was not very effective because it was at the very early stage, and registration of persons with disabilities in itself was a big challenge. So, and when we talk about people with disabilities at the policy making level, there is only one question. It comes in almost all the discussions that how many they are, and then discussion is halted there that because we don't know how many they are. So later on, after the ratification of the UN Convention by Government of Pakistan in 2011, when Pakistan was the 110th country to ratify this convention, there was a huge change in the legislative framework in the country. Rights-based legislation was drafted, and very first time in the Sindh province, Disability Act was enacted, then Balochistan, then Gilgit-Baltistan, and now recently, most recently, Ministry of Human Rights has presented that bill, Honorable Minister Mr. Mazari, and it was accepted by the House. And now we have ICT rights of persons with disability in it.
So Atif Saab, with this rich context of progressive advancement towards recognizing, acknowledging, mainstreaming rights of persons with disabilities, where do you see National Action Plan being leveraged upon?
Sure. First of all, in the national, business are key to contribute in the economic empowerment of the society. So if businesses will be sensible about disability or sensitive on disability inclusion agenda, then it will make a big shift in the economic condition of people with disabilities and their families. So in National Action Plan, first of all, I would like to briefly recommend that in priority areas where a word vulnerability or vulnerable population has been used widely, they should be categorically identified people with disabilities, because it's a whole dynamic of the business. If businesses are inclusive in terms of environment, in terms of culture, accepting diversity, then people with disabilities can be part of it. So for the sake of rhetoric or discussion at least, and priority areas, the vulnerability should be further defined and people with disabilities should be mentioned. And another part, like when we talk about international commitments, we know that sustainable development goals are clearly mentioning about disability indicators. So we need to include that perspective also in National Action Plan that one of the international commitment is to inclusion of disability in the workplace, inclusion of disability in the economic development of the country. Plus, in national NAP, we also can mention about when we are talking about this responsible businesses, corporate responsibility of the business, we can also include disability inclusion. Top of the like CSR, that if they are including marginalized communities, they can also address the issue of addressing the assistive devices and technology to be enabled for people with disabilities. Another place where I would recommend very crisply that in National Action Plan in equal opportunities, when we are saying about equal opportunities for at the workplace, we have not identified people with disabilities as a human resource. While ILO Convention and UNCRPD and now SDGs, they're clearly highlighting that people with disabilities must have access to decent work and gainable employment opportunities. Plus, one more thing in the last part of the NAP, there's a monitoring mechanism established by the combination of a stakeholder group. So if people with disabilities or their organizations like DPOs, Disabled People's Organization run by themselves, could be part of the multi-stakeholder group, it can affect it can affect the implementation of NAP and ensuring that people with disabilities are part of it.
Thank you very much indeed, Atif Sheikh Saab. And we look forward to hearing more with regards to your reflections and collecting your inputs in the breakout sessions. Thank you for highlighting and reminding all of us that Pakistan, which is world's sixth most sort of fastly urbanizing country, 15% of the population comprises of persons with disabilities who, in your words, have found themselves rather unheard and uncounted for amongst the key policies and processes. And you have highlighted that within the National Action Plan, while you have welcomed the idea of including the disability agenda, you have reminded us that not to sort of aggregate persons with disabilities within the larger categories such as the vulnerable populations. And you've also pointed out quite critically with regards to the monitoring framework of the National Action Plan to include persons with disabilities and that so that they have not only a voice, but they're part of the process. Thank you very much indeed. Until we meet again very soon in the breakout sessions, ladies and gentlemen, we'll move on with the proceedings of this section of the session. And it is my very happy duty to invite Dr. Sara Saeed. Dr. Sara Saeed is co-founder and CEO of Sehat Kahani. Dr. Sara Saeed Khurram has over 5 years of experience in the field of digital healthcare. As the co-founder and chief executive of Sehat Kahani, Sehat Kahani is an all-female provider network, including that it is working to create quality healthcare solutions for communities where health access and quality affordability of healthcare is still long awaited. Using cost-effective ICT-enabled solutions, Sehat Kahani has impacted over 1.5 million people globally with its telemedicine platform. Dr. Sara, very warm welcome to this session. And with regards to the two key areas that we would like to hear from you very succinctly, given we have 4 minutes for this session, are that you have done exemplary work during the COVID-19, setting up an example of how businesses can respect as well as protect the rights of persons in communities, in particular those who are most disadvantaged and dispossessed. Please share with us the trajectory that you and your organization and colleagues took in times of COVID-19 and its impact in order to ensure the most disadvantaged and dispossessed persons access to medical and health care. Thank you. Over to you, Dr. Sarah.
Thank you so much, Salman. And it was a pleasure to hear all the other speakers. It's a pleasure to be here. So thank you for the invitation. I run an organization in Pakistan called Sehat Kahani, as you said. And the primary work of the company is to connect a large pool of underutilized, untapped female doctors who somehow got left out from the medical workforce due to socio-cultural norms that inhibit a woman to work after graduation being a medical doctor in Pakistan. And we connect them to patients who need access to healthcare using a telemedicine-based solution, which is an audio-video chat platform. And the organization started with the idea of creating clinics in low-income communities, which are manned by nurses. And these women nurses in the community, whenever a patient comes to them, they connect the patient to an online doctor. While we were making this network of clinics in Pakistan, we also thought of creating a mobile application for the masses 1 year into our journey. And this mobile application allows anyone, people like you and me, to connect to a doctor 24/7 in less than 3 clicks and in less than 60 seconds. And we provide this application to corporations for their employees' healthcare, to retail consumers, and through nurses in low-income communities who don't have clinics, to patients whom they can reach out to in their homes. When COVID-19 came in, I think before COVID-19, it was a struggle and a challenge to make people believe that patients can also be seen by doctors virtually, and it is much better for a patient to be seen by a quality doctor virtually rather than a quack or a midwife or a dispenser that is usually present in our communities and have malpractice and malnegligence. So we got an opportunity to partner with the federal government very early on in the first week of COVID-19, and we made our application free of cost for 6 months, which allowed everyone to download the app and use and connect to a doctor absolutely free of cost. In partnership with the federal government, we were also able to test, track, and quarantine COVID-19 cases for them using online mediums, and also just propel the idea of telemedicine on a public health level. I think the second thing that we did, again in collaboration with UNDP specifically, was we connected our app through in ICUs all across Pakistan, 60 public and private ICUs, so that junior doctors who were forced to see critical care emergencies in Pakistan, having no formal training in critical care, they could connect to critical care consultants all over the world and get guidance from the patients who were in the ICU at that time. Again, a multi-stakeholder project with provincial, federal governments, as well as UNDP resulted in us providing our services in 60 ICUs. And I guess on an organizational level, it has given us as a company motivation that a country where 50% of our population does not get to see a doctor in their lifetime. And of course, women and children are much more disenfranchised than other populations in the country for a lot of issues that they can't talk to a male doctor or a male dispenser. For example, sexual health, reproductive issues, infertility issues, mental health issues. People with disabilities, they can't go to tertiary care hospitals in the country. They can get access to qualified care doing telemedicine, and this is getting normalized. A challenge that I want to state here on this forum, as Atif Saab also mentioned, that health is mentioned in the National Action Plan, but there is more room to introduce digital health interventions because Pakistan till date does not have a digital health policy. It is not recognized in the PMC right now. It is not recognized by the federal government. It is not recognized at the provincial government level. Even after a lot of interventions being produced in digital health by the government and by the development sector, there is a need for formal regulation and policy, because until we do that, we won't be able to ensure that we're providing quality care through digital health, and we won't be able to hold anyone accountable for the interventions that are being conducted at a public and private level.
Thank you very much indeed, Dr. Sarah. And I would like to highlight here that we, in the chat box, we have inputs from Mr. Tanveer with regards to the Christian Care Foundation that continues to collaborate with the Ministry of Human Rights, Government of Pakistan, and the Chamber of Commerce, and have organized seminars on the topic of awareness on fundamental rights of the religious minorities. It is the detailed input is available in the chat box for colleagues to have a look at. We also have a message of commendation and congratulations from Livio to the Federal Ministry of Human Rights Secretary, Mr. Enam, for support for BHR agenda and also for the launch of the draft. And there are a couple of questions. Those questions will be forwarded to this Honorable Secretary, and the responses would be collated and shared with this forum in the course of the process. Ladies and gentlemen, it's my very happy duty now to invite our next guest speaker, Ms. Menahil Khan, who is Senior Research Fellow at the Research Society of International Law. Ms. Khan is a Senior Research Fellow at RSIL's Islamabad office. Her areas of expertise are human rights, detention regimes, counterterrorism, and environmental law. She has worked on the intersection between business and human rights for the past 2 years in Pakistan. She has also been engaged with UNDP and the Ministry of Human Rights in conducting a national baseline assessment and developing the National Action Plan on Business and Human Rights. A very warm welcome to you, Ms. Menahil Khan. And two quick prompters for your reflection for this brief intervention on your part. You have been engaged with the process of development of the National Action Plan's draft in Pakistan. And knowing the National Action Plan draft and the process so closely, what do you think are the two key challenges and two key opportunities for its implementation? Thank you very much. Over to you, Ms.
Thank
Khan.
you. Thank you, Salman Saab. I feel very fortunate to be a part of this multi-stakeholder dialogue, and thank you for inviting me to this and for the lovely introduction as well. Regarding your question on challenges and opportunities, I'm going to try and limit my thoughts to about 5 minutes. Firstly, I believe that the National Action Plan has come at a very good time in terms of the SDGs and the UNGPs. We are 10 years from implementation of the SDGs, and we're 10 years, and it's been 10 years since we've had the UNGPs. So in terms of the timing, I think the National Action Plan has come at a good time. Additionally, the COVID-19 pandemic has, I think, really strengthened and brought to the precipice the link between business activity and human rights. And to see the National Action Plan leveraging that, using that is also really, it's a good sort of step on the state's part. I also think that at this time where economies are reinventing themselves, reconfiguring themselves, and businesses are also rethinking how they're doing business, it's good to create a movement around embedding human rights into business activity, as we have seen time and again during the crisis, that businesses that were more sustainable were more resilient to the crisis. And in relation to this, the state, in line with the National Action Plan, can help businesses assess the impact of COVID-19 on stakeholders. And also, I think because of COVID-19 and because of what we've seen in the past year, the National Action Plan looks into the right to health, which is crucial and something that has been on the agenda for many years, but has been periodically sidestepped. It also takes into consideration the evolving nature of occupational risks and provides recommendations on that, which is good, as it highlights how law and policy needs to evolve in relation to health.
The pandemic, of course, also comes with a host of challenges relating to the implementation and formulation of the NAP. We have seen that there are certain communities and sectors that have been disproportionately affected, and there needs to be a comprehensive plan whereby we start viewing workers and labor differently. And this needs to be reflected in the National Action Plan, which right now to some may be more of a top-down document. And despite the fact that there have been consultations, these have been mostly larger cities. And while it is remarkable that the National Action Action Plan is available online for recommendations. I think we need to keep in mind that there is a serious digital divide in Pakistan, where many of those who are most vulnerable and affected by policies at a top level do not have access to the internet and will not be able to make valuable contributions to this. So there needs to be a plan in place for that as well. And I think this might be a challenge considering the frequent lockdowns that we have seen over the past 1 year. Secondly, in terms of opportunities, I think the National Action Plan on BHR aligns very well with Pakistan's international commitments. And this is something which will help us with our GSP Plus status, where we've moved on from ratification to implementation. And this is also something that will help us with the universal periodic review cycles, with our treaty reporting. And it will also help Pakistan emerge as a responsible trade partner in the region, considering we are one of the first countries right now to have a draft National Action Plan up for consultations. And the fact that, apart from that, moving on to the NAP itself in terms of challenges, I think one of the main challenges is the fact that the NAP proposes 73 action points arranged over 9 priority areas. This in itself is very ambitious, and there needs to be a more cogent implementation plan for this, especially in relation to the cost associated with some of the action points. For example, and as the Secretary spoke as well, the National Action Plan talks about a review of the PEPRA rules and incorporation of due diligence requirements. And while this is great, considering there's a lot of international momentum on this, I think we need more information regarding how this can be done, as I do see this to be a bit of a challenge, especially when you're involving business entities into this and how they respond to such measures. So I think whatever happens needs to have strong coordination with CSOs and the business community. But it is good to see that there's a lot of room for that in the National Action Plan, which time and again refers to trade unions, the business community, and CSOs in relation to implementing the National Action Plan. Additionally, I also think that one of the main issues and main challenges that will come in relation to the implementation of the National Action Plan, and which has been mentioned earlier as well, is the informality of our economy. And so many people are not documented. There's so many workers who are not documented, and it's difficult to see how the state will ensure that they are given their rights. And while it's important that the National Action Plan contains a whole section on domestic workers and the informal economy, I still think that this is something that could be a challenge, especially in relation to domestic workers, and where we see that there are many females who are currently engaged. And
I'm sorry to interrupt, but I think that's a key point that you've just made. That reminds me, you've been part of the entire process of development of National Action Plan. Could you very succinctly highlight the role of provinces in the development with regards to consultations, with regards to receiving their inputs, and also with regards to ensuring that the provincial partners are also equal stakeholders in terms of implementation of the BHR agenda?
So if you look at the National Action Plan, you can see that in most of the implementing partners in relation to action points are provincial stakeholders. And this National Action Plan has gone to every province in the country and we've had consultations on this, and all the contributions from the provinces have been incorporated into the National Action Plan. And you can see that there are specific points for provinces as well, in addition to the federal government. Moving on from this also, I would just like to highlight that one of the key areas of the National Action Plan is women and gender equality. And there's some excellent points regarding safe working spaces in that, and trainings on sexual harassment, where I think provinces can also take a very leading role into this. However, I do think that we really need to look into Pakistan's gender gap and really look at the underlying patriarchy in society. And that's something that needs to be addressed in the National Action Plan. And we need to go beyond corporations and also look at, all sorts of people who are affected by business activity throughout supply chains. Lastly, my last point in relation to challenges is that I feel that we need to create large-scale awareness on the link between business activity and human rights. Consumers especially need to be made more aware of this. This is something that needs to be explored further within the National Action Plan, because we have seen in the past, there have been businesses which have had reports of gross human rights violations, but they continue to thrive. So I think this is something that needs to be explored further within the National Action Plan. Yes, I think
Thank you very much indeed.
Gone beyond my.
No, that's very kind. Thank you. Very helpful. Before I move on to invite our next speaker guest, let me just remind ourselves that Dr. Sarah Said, speaker guest today before Minahal, she had pointed out the necessity and the urgent need for the government to consider digital health policy and to ensure that there is health policy in terms of digitization or digital health policy is sort of enshrined within the formal regulation and the policy framework. Finding us some of the key areas where there still is a room for review, and we are at a stage with the national larger section of citizenship and citizenry in Pakistan and stakeholders. So that needs to be somehow addressed, that the feedback is not only invited digitally, but there is another way of receiving feedback, whether through focus group discussions or other fora. You also pointed out the impact of COVID-19 pandemic and lockdowns on the implementation of National Action Plan. And that needs to be studied much deeper and much further beyond it has already been looked at within the National Action Plan. In terms of other challenges that need to be further elaborated and addressed in the National Action Plan, you talked about the gender inequality across various levels and across the spectrum, and with tangible, well-defined, specified actions to address that. But in terms of opportunities, you also pointed out that this really provides the state and the government of Pakistan to report back in terms of the universal periodic review reports, in terms of other international and national human rights commitments, and indeed with regards to the GSP+. You pointed out that there are 73 action points, and these action points need to be somehow associated more clearly with budgeting and resources, so costing of the action points. With this, I will move to our next speaker guest, Mr. Majid Aziz. Mr. Majid Aziz, until recently, was the president of the Employers Federation of Pakistan. He has served as the president of South Asian Forum of Employers and also as the president of the Karachi Chamber of Commerce and Industry. At present, he is president of MHG Group of Companies and member board of directors of the Agricultural Development Bank of Pakistan. He has also been the chairman of the board of directors of SME Bank Limited, former directors of KESC, and many other prestigious organizations. He has also been the member of the managing committee of the Employers Federation of Pakistan for 7 terms and is a founding trustee of the EFP Trust. Without further ado, a very, very warm welcome to you, Majid Aziz Sahib. And for you, just in terms of prompters or your reflections, your organization, Employers Federation of Pakistan, has recently been nominated as the national focal point for the promotion of M&E declaration. Could you please highlight one key initiative being done to advance sustainable and socially inclusive work in Pakistan? And could you also please highlight briefly one key opportunity for linking the BHR agenda in Pakistan and the implementation of National Action Plan? You've got 4 points, 4 minutes for this brief intervention, but we look forward to deeper discussion and deeper sort of set of elaborations from you in the breakout sessions. Over to you, Majid Aziz Sahib.
Hello.
Yes, we can hear you now, Majid Aziz Sahib.
All right, thank you very much, Salman. Before I go further, I want to compliment and felicitate Dr. Sarah Saeed, and her team for doing an excellent work. And I think it is being recognized and it should be universally recognized. So, on behalf of the EFP, my best compliments to her and her team. Secondly, in fact, I was just given 24 hours notice to be here because my president has to be here in Lahore, Islamabad, because PM Saib is inaugurating some workers' welfare, some project. Third thing is that Salman, there is no representative from the workers' federations in today's session. I think you should have had someone directly. I'm not talking about any labor research person. I'm talking about actual workers' federation leadership. Anyway, coming back to the main point. Uh, you asked me what are the key initiative we have done. The Employees Forum Pakistan, is the apex body of manufacturers of Pakistan, and we have been playing a leading role in implementing the three phases of the MNAD project under our theme, More and Better Jobs Through Socially Responsible Labor Practices in Pakistan Sports Goods Sector. Ever since we started the project about 6 years ago, we've done the baseline survey, gap analysis, uh, and to identify in the sports goods industry in Sialkot. As you know, Sialkot it has seven important sectors and uh, for exports, including sports, surgical, leather, gloves, garments, etc., etc. Uh, what we also did was we organized awareness raising sessions in Sialkot, Lahore, and Karachi on the MNAD principles. Then we established a task force for promoting sustainable and responsible business in the Sialkot sports good manufacturing sector. We have trained in the factories over 400 managers and workers of various enterprises in the sports goods sector, uh, in IR, that is industrial relation, OSH, productivity, fundamental principle right of work, and the MNED principles. We also, although, you know, uh, if you really want to create awareness raising on child labor, you have to go down the level, not in five-star hotels or Zoom sessions. But because of ILO, we had to do the World Day, organize the World Day programs on child labor in many cities like Sialkot, Faisalabad, Peshawar, Lahore, Karachi, etc. Now, regarding sports related, we are in collaboration with the Pakistan Olympic Association under the theme Sports for All, Decent Work for All. Now, when you mentioned the key opportunities, I think we are well placed to engage the business enterprises to help them identify, prevent, and mitigate as much as possible the human rights related risks in their activities and in the business relationships. Uh, we give a lot of importance to OSH, and we also conduct audits in the factories, and we try to identify the gaps, and we uh, um, uh, make them understand, motivate them, and help them, the industries, in being compliant with the international labor, the core international labor standards. Furthermore, we also provide enough assistance to these enterprises through our consultancy, special attention given to gender-based harassment, sexual violence, and I would like to, on from here, I think the Pakistan should immediately ratify ILO Convention 190 that deals with harassment and violence at the place of work. This should be our priority, and I hope somebody is listening here. We are also doing advocacy and lobbying in the current policies, legislations, regulations in addressing all these risks of business involvement in in all gross human rights abuses. Let
Thank
me
you.
here add,
Yeah.
please let me, yes, I want to add one more thing, if you don't mind. We
Right.
are working very closely with the governments regarding labor inspection, and with the workers, we are gung-ho about social dialogue, and for that, we had formed 25, 30 years ago with the moderate laborship, the Workers' Employers Bilateral Council of Pakistan, because this is now very important, especially as somebody mentioned GSP Plus. So that is very, very important. Thank you.
That's very kind of you. Majid Saab, thank you. I think you just you reflected on the point that I was about to ask you when you said that your organization and your network are very well placed to engage the private enterprise to advance and proceed further human rights and business agenda. And then you disaggregated various streams where you have already engaged, and the National Action Plan can further provide impetus and sort of provide fuel for the engine of proceeding further the business and human rights agenda, whether it is with regards to gender equality, whether it's regard to zero tolerance for gender-based harassment or sexual harassment at the workplace, whether it is with regards to child labor, whether it's regard to the consumer rights. Thank you very much for giving us this comprehensive overview, and we look forward to your continued engagement with this session and the breakout sessions as well. Ladies and gentlemen, dear colleagues and friends, we are now going to move into